Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. Today, we're going to be reviewing last week's brand new strategy announced by the Federal Reserve, and we're going to look at it through the perspective of three lenses: the scientific method, inflation, and employment. Now, before your eyes roll into the back of your head, please stick with us because this is all about helping you understand, you learn how the creation and destruction of money affects your finances, your economy, our politics, our society. This show is called Making Sense. It's a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and I am joined by Jeff Snyder, a man who's not afraid to peer into the shadows, to bring the torch of knowledge and shove it into the shadows and illuminate it for all of us. Jeff, pleasure to speak with you again this week.
Good to see you again, Emil.
Absolutely. So every week you post 6, 7, 8, 9 articles, blog posts at Alhambra Investments. And then once a week, you post a nice long essay at Real Clear Markets. And I would say, no offense, Jeff, that this one is more approachable, more enjoyable for the people that don't want a lot of graphs or math in their economic discussion. And today's essay at Real Clear Markets, it's called Murphy's Law is Fed's Law, and Everything is Wrong. For our international audience, what is Murphy's Law?
Well, it's a common American idiom, an expression that, I think a lot of people assume came out of World War II, like a lot of our common American idioms. It actually came out about a little bit later than World War II, in the late 1940s. And the modern version of it, because it's been updated, the modern version of it that I think that most Americans know is whatever will go wrong or whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And there's sort of a, kind of a fatalism, ironic, nihilism embedded in it that says, we should just be prepared for things to go bad and not worry about it because, that's just the way the world works. But that's not at all exactly, that's not how the original expression started and where it came about. And I think most people would prefer the original expression because it captured a completely different sentiment. Even though the wording was almost identical, what it really meant was very different.
Well, before we get to Murphy, because there is a real Murphy, like there really is.
I know. I was shocked too when I was looking, doing some research on it. There was actually a guy named Murphy, which is probably the exception to the rule, right?
That's not true. There's a man that actually was called Phillips that invented the Phillips screwdriver, and maybe even there was a Phillips that invented the myth of the Phillips curve. All right, I'm looking ahead a little bit to an episode. We're going to a segment we're going to be doing a little bit later. Let's get back to this one. Captain John Paul Stapp. Who was he in this story?
He is really the central figure in Murphy's Law. And really, he's an unappreciated hero of American life that we don't really, is another one of those figures that did all these incredibly amazing things that we don't know about. Yet every time you and I get into a car, we owe a debt of gratitude to this guy. And this is a guy who he was also a military captain. He worked at Edwards Air Force Base, and he was also a medical doctor at the time. So he had a wide range of training, and his mission was to find out about safety, specifically, in terms of test pilots riding around in these fast jets that were about to break the sound barrier, and what were the limits of the human body at such massive forces and high altitudes and low temperatures and low oxygen. But he also got into, climbing into these rocket sleds to test the G-forces of deceleration and acceleration on his own body. He'd get into a rocket sled and propel himself along at almost the speed of sound and then decelerate as quickly as he possibly could just to test what it did to himself so that human beings would have some idea of what actually took place, what forces the human body underwent under great strain and great pressure. And of course, the application was not just test pilots and even just military jets. Captain Stapp began working with the automobile industry, helping the automobile industry understand what happened in traffic collisions when cars came together in the exact wrong way. What were the kinds of forces that people riding inside of cars would experience in a high-speed crash or even a low-speed crash? A lot of the safety science that we have today goes back to this the late 1940s period and what Captain Stapp was doing, riding around in rocket sleds.
And for anyone who doesn't know what a rocket sled is, you can see one in the opening sequence of Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, which was the fourth Indiana Jones, and which we will never speak of again. And Jeff, you were mentioning this guy's a hero. He would be covered in personal protection equipment all the time when he went through these things. He tell the story of when he was flying essentially in his shorts.
Yeah, he was an amazing guy. Like I said, there's an incredible story. He put himself at risk and really no concern whatsoever for his own safety. And there's lots of additional stories about some of the trauma that his body went through, including what they called whiteouts, where I think the acceleration forces was so extreme, the blood moved all the way back into his head and left him essentially blind, temporarily blind. But, back then, there was no science on this stuff. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. So even though he was blinded for, I think it was a couple hours, maybe even a day, they weren't sure his vision was ever going to come back. And then he experienced something called a redout, where all the blood rushed forward into his eyes and busted his capillaries and things like that. I mean, amazing kinds of stuff that this guy put himself through because they were learning on the fly. Nobody had ever done this before, and they were trying to attempt to learn some very serious things about what makes, you think about an automobile, how irreplaceable is that to the modern world? Yet a big part of the reason that that's the case is because of the science, the on-the-ground retail science that was taking place in the California deserts in the late 1940s. People just winging it, essentially. Let's see what we can do. Let's see what the equipment can do. Let's test the limits of everything that we're able to accomplish.
It was real courage, real heroism, and this is when Murphy comes into the story because he wanted to make sure that the equipment was working appropriately. So tell the story about.
Yeah, that's it. If you're pushing the envelope, the edge of all human knowledge and everything that we know, you can't do it. Half-assed equipment. You have to make sure that everything works. And so the environment that they had created was, look, we're winging it. We're putting all this stuff together. We're not really sure what we're doing. So we have to think ahead to every little detail. We have to think about what can go wrong. And so that's where the original Murphy's Law came in. Because, Captain Murphy was, one of these military guys who just briefly enters the story. There's a foul-up about a couple of transducers, which are sensors that measure G-force. It wasn't a major issue. And I believe the original expression was, if it can happen, it will happen. And what Murphy was saying essentially was, look, we need to be aware of all of the things that can potentially happen because we've never done these things before, and the consequences of failure can be catastrophic.
So this is what I have. Maybe it's apocryphal, but Captain Murphy said, when he heard about those transducers, if that guy has any way of making a mistake, he will. And then Stapp was the one that said, if it can happen, it will, during a press conference.
Right. It was Stapp who was, really not only a doctor and a really courageous son of a bitch. He was also a very witty guy and a very open guy and a very warm guy who had to do this press conference a couple of days after Captain Murphy showed up and admonished these technicians that screwed up the transducers with the raw Murphy's Law. And for the press, we're asking him, this is really dangerous stuff that you're doing. How can you go out there and push the envelope of everything that human beings have done before and expand our knowledge and do all of these dangerous things? And he said, basically what Murphy said, what they started to call Murphy's Law, because they start thinking ahead. If it can happen, it will happen. That allows them to be able to do these really high tech, high dangerous kinds of things, because they're always thinking in detail about what did we miss, what did we screw up, what can potentially go wrong that we don't know that we need to overcome. And it's an elegant saying.
And so we're going to segue now to the Federal Reserve and how that story naturally lends itself to our present day. But before we do, I just want to read this passage of yours because I find it poignant and I wanted to share it with the audience. Quote, "The original Murphy's Law was a hope-filled expression of harsh reality being surmounted by retail-level human genius. simple, elegant, devastatingly powerful because it was small s science, practiced in another one of those beautifully informal settings. No wonder it was corrupted. Jeff, segue into the Federal Reserve and the scientism and how it was corrupted, and what last week's new announcements, new grand strategy, how it all fits together.
Well, I think that's really the major point here is the original Murphy's Law. If it can happen, it will happen. There's an element of humility involved in that. It's we think we know what we're doing, but we have to be prepared for the possibility that what we think we know isn't what we really know. That's what it really says. It's like, look, we know we got things going. We're pushing the envelope. We're doing all these high tech experiments. We're really going beyond what anybody has done before. So we have to have a little bit of humility in pushing that edge, and always going for the edge and thinking human beings are not perfect and we're not perfectible. Therefore, we have to be able to look inward at ourselves and look at ourselves honestly and say, what did we maybe screw up? What could we possibly have screwed up? Because we don't know everything that we should know. And that's really the important point of the original Murphy's Law. And that's why I like it so much better, because it starts from a place of humility, not fatalism, but more of, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to overcome it. But the way we're going to overcome these barriers is by being honest about the fact that we could be wrong and we could get something wrong. And therefore, we got to do something about it.
Well, was the Federal Reserve being honest that they got something wrong? I guess they weren't explicit about it because they announced that they are going to let inflation run pure at a higher average rate. And the implicit explanation is, well, that's because we couldn't get our target. We couldn't meet our target because the employment situation wasn't as good as we had said. That's implicit. So were they being honest?
Well, I think what's really going on with when you look, again, this is not just one event or a one-off event, this grand strategy review that just wrapped up and was announced at Jackson Hole. This is a whole series of experimentations going on that go all the way back to August of 2007. So for 13 years, monetary policymakers have been experimenting with all sorts of, or what they say are all sorts of different monetary programs. And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? And what are all of these conclusions designed to say? And yet, the explanations they keep coming up with are even more strange and more weird and more substantial every time they have to go through one of these explanations or go through these transitions from one type of monetary program to another type of monetary program. What it really comes down to is, again, going back to the original Murphy's Law, being honest about failure. And what happens here is that the monetary policymakers are never honest about failure, because the more evidence that shows monetary policy doesn't work, the tighter they grip to that very faith. The idea that, no, monetary policy always works, and therefore, working backwards from science, the way science is supposed to be, instead we're going to try to figure out what's wrong with everything else. Monetary policy works, and if it's not creating the results we want, it's because everything else must be broken. And that's as unscientific as it gets. And when you actually look at and break down the literature, the data, the reasons, the rationalizing behind what Jay Powell talked about last week, what really they're saying here, what they're really doing is fitting their predetermined conclusion into all this evidence that shows that they're wrong. They start with the premise that monetary policy always works, and because they can't find any evidence for it, they're working backward to try to plausibly reverse engineer an explanation for how that could be.
That's right. And so for our audience who didn't see last week's episodes, 24, part 1 and part 2, we spend a lot more time getting into the nitty-gritty of what the Federal Reserve actually announced with the grand strategy. But Jeff, to your point right now, my favorite analogy, and it's one I've raised before, so forgive me to your audience, it's the idea of what the Federal Reserve is doing now by saying we are correct, and from there we can explain everything. My favorite analogy is the one of that whirling spirographic web the planets had to follow if you put Earth at the center of the universe. And that somewhat inexplicably that some planets loitered and then flipped back while others continued along with any slowdown. But like you said, they had to fit the data first and then come up with an explanation, a hypothesis that explained their original assumption. And ironically, Jeff, I'm going to turn to a religious figure to help kind of make a decision between, should we go with the complicated answer, the one the Federal Reserve is offering us, or the more simple one? And so I ask you, English Franciscan friar William of Ockham, he helped us decide which circumstance is more plausible here. Can you tell the audience, Jeff, off the top of your head, who was Ockham and whether he was a scholastic philosopher and theologian or the inventor of a bladed tool used to shave hair?
I don't know why they call it the razor, but it's a razor, and nonetheless, right? And it's
That's
really,
right.
it's the idea that sometimes when all the evidence points toward one direction, you should probably follow what all the evidence is pointing toward.
The simplest explanation.
Well, it's not necessarily. I think there's a corollary to Occam's razors that says, essentially what I just stated, that when everything says this is what's going on, you shouldn't, deny the evidence even that much stronger. Your resistance to the evidence shouldn't be proportional to the strength of the evidence. It's almost an inverse relationship with the Fed, because the longer it goes that they can't do what they say they can do, the more evidence piles up that it's not working, that monetary policy failures, the tighter they cling to this fantasy that the next QE will work, or 5 more years of ZERP will be the ticket. And that's how you end up being Japan. That's how you end up in the Japanese situation, which nobody wants to talk about, but that's exactly what's going on. And Japanification, by the way, was never really about zombie banks and all the stuff people talk about in the 90s. It's about exactly what we're talking about here. It's the unscientific process of never being honest enough to say, what if central bankers saying, what if we've got all this wrong? What if we're the problem? Once you realize that might be the possibility, all the stuff, like you mentioned with the Ptolemaic viewpoint of the solar system, once you remove Earth from the center, you don't need all these convoluted, weird kinds of engineers and, all of these kinds of big and weird stuff. You can just look at things straightforward and say, the evidence is what the evidence is because it makes sense.
Jeff, you end this essay with a 4th version of Murphy's Law. Do you have that handy, or should I read it out?
I think I have it handy. They've perverted Murphy's Law. The Federal Reserve in particular has perverted Murphy's Law into another iteration that says monetary policy will never go wrong, so everything else will.
And so the evolution has gone from, if that guy has any way of making a mistake, he will, exasperation, to, if it can happen, it will, humility. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong, fatalism. And then now your 4th version, the one we're living through, hubris.